All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Montana Book Festival event, an interview of Catherine Lacey conducted by VK Now. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our Collector's Edition sponsor, Whitefish Review, for supporting us, and in doing so, supporting contemporary literature in the American West. Our festival would not be possible without the support of this and other sponsors. We're really excited to welcome Catherine and V. Hi, you two. I'm going to read your bios and then sort of hand it over to you. Get this interview going. Catherine Lacey is the author of Nobody Is Ever Missing, winner of a 2016 Whiting Award and a finalist for the Young Lions Fiction Award, and The Answers, as well as Pew, the book at hand here. In 2017, she was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. Her essays and fiction have been published widely and translated into Italian, French, Dutch, Spanish, and German. She was born in Mississippi and is based in Chicago. VK Now is the author of Sheep Machine, and Umbilical Hospital, and of the short stories collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture, which won FC2's Ronald Sukenick Innovative Fiction Prize in 2016, the novel Fish in Exile, and the poetry collection, The Old Philosopher, which won the Nightboat Books Prize for Poetry in 2014. Her work includes poetry, fiction, film, and cross-genre collaboration. Her stories, poems, and drawings have appeared in Noon, Plowshares, Black Warrior Review, and Bomb, among others. She holds an MFA in fiction from Brown University, where she received the John Hawkes and Feldman Prizes in fiction and the Kim Ann R. Stark Memorial Award in poetry. All right, Catherine V., welcome and take it away.
Thanks for introduction, Lauren, and thanks for inviting us virtually to Montana. It would be nice to actually be there, but it's nice to be over here looking towards you guys.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
Thank you, Lawrence, for setting all this up. So I'll just jump right in and just start asking Catherine questions. Today I guess I am going to talk more about Pew and ask questions regarding Pew, but it could be a little bit outside of it, a little. Let's see. So I'll just, since I recently viewed your interview with Jesse Ball, I'll just tap into that a little, and then we can use that as a springboard. Your sweetheart, Jesse Ball, in your Harvard bookstore conversation with him recently, asked you the following question. American fiction is written as if the world makes perfect sense. There remains but a story to be told. Your fiction isn't like this. Why? And of course, I disagree with him. However, based on this premise that the world makes sense and yours doesn't, if a strong wind were to blow through all of your work, suffering all the pages of each of your already written books, published, unpublished, still in the middle of writing, stories, and you have one paperclip, which is on your wrist tattoo. You had one paperclip tattoo on your wrist to hold the pages together to guarantee that the story makes sense. Which piece of yours would you use that paperclip on?
I guess lately, okay, well, there's a couple of questions there, but I guess this paperclip one, which I think is very clever, I think it's weird because one doesn't really realize why, like, as you know, you've been a writer for a really long time as well and written all sorts of different things, and it's hard to know why you started doing that or what it is. It's not like a person can boil the reason that they're writing down to just one thing. And yet the longer you do write things, the more you realize that you're kind of circling the same set of ideas. and sort of, I guess, becoming frustrated with not ever figuring out everything that you want to say about it, or never sort of completing the thought that it kind of exists sort of murkily in your brain. And I guess it's a surprise to me that it seems to me that like identity is this concern that I apparently have. And I don't mean like I don't mean like woman or white or whatever, but more like the strangeness of identity, just the strangeness of having to be one person your entire life. I feel like the longer I'm alive, the more that seems very, very like unfair. I guess I'm like angry about this, but I don't know who to be angry with. And then also I'm trying to find some way out of it, which I guess is sort of the project of fiction in general, is that you get to sort of get a little bit outside of your experience, maybe enough to make it make a little bit of sense, or enough to make it strange to you so that you don't have to make it make sense. So I guess it's just this like this identity shape that I have to be connected to a history and sort of progressing in a linear, I guess, way through time. Yeah, but then it's funny, I don't, we did that interview just like a few months ago, Jesse and I did here, and it's funny because like he sometimes makes statements about about what he thinks like American fiction is or something, and I don't tend to like disagree with him like in the moment, but now like thinking back to it, I'm not sure if I completely agree that all of American fiction is writing as if the world makes sense. I guess maybe what he was referring to is maybe like popular American fiction, like think that the books that are that sell the most copies and are read by the most Americans. I guess that maybe those books, I can't say that I'm like the most well-versed in all of those books, like who could say that, but it does seem to me that like there's a kind of desire for a narrative to be balanced and for everything to like make sense in this way that I feel like is I feel like that's unfair to the reader. I feel like the world doesn't make sense to me. I don't pretend like I'm some sort of authority and I'm going to sit down and write a book about like the world, because obviously I don't think anything makes sense. Like I'm still in the kind of fundamental disagreement with just the fact of existence. Like that, just that alone already seems to me sort of meaty enough to push against for an entire lifetime. And so why would I write a story of like, the social novel, or like a novel that's about the importance of family or something like this, where like, yeah, maybe this idea can kind of hold water in a certain if you have a certain view of what's happening in this country, or you have the privilege to only be concerned with I don't know, to only be concerned with like, are all of your children going to get enough good education, but like, if that's not your concern, then writing fiction becomes like a much more, I mean, I don't mean that specifically, but if your concerns are not, are a little bit broader, and I think most people at their heart, our concerns are very broad. They're not as specific as they maybe seem at first. Then you end up writing fiction or wanting to read fiction that will acknowledge that, And so I guess that's sort of the place that I write from. Just a place of an agreement already with, I want to write from a place where I already have an agreement with the reader that not everything's going to end up okay at the end of this, like we're not going to reach a place of finality and conclusion. We're just going to go into like the murk together,
I thought your book, Pew, actually makes a lot of sense because it followed, like it started out on I guess on a week, right? Like you can, so it's very organized. I felt like it's very thoughtfully organized. And so I did not, when I think of things not making sense, I think it's all combobulated. I think the writer takes no time in organizing the structure. So I walked into the book thinking that I would be combobulated. And all the characters kind of move through the landscape of grief and confession in a way that feels very organized, like they have a particular role in the structure, and no one is away from those structure at all. And to me, chaos is born from those revolutionary acts of like, okay, I'll merge into something that I'm not completely am. For instance, if Pew were to run a monologue that lasts for 5 hours, and everyone is just like, oh, okay, so this is not the type of transaction, existential transaction that you would think a Pew. And it made me think, like, if you were to write this book, if Pew were Nelson, and would you rewrite Pew as Nelson? You feel the book would be more passive or less passive?
It's such an interesting question. And I think your observation of the book making sense, I guess at first I want to set, there's different kinds of making sense, right? And there's like making moral sense, which I have like maybe very little interest in trying to pursue like that line of making sense of something. And then there's making sense just in terms of like timeline and how people are treating each other. And like that one, maybe I'm like a little bit more interested in like, well, I want the reader to be situated in time and space just enough so that we can like get things together. And then there's like other kinds of making sense. Like one, it doesn't make sense that the main character of the book has they have no history, they have no race, they have no gender, and it's not like they are genderqueer or racially ambiguous or anything like this. Like they have none, and of course that's illogical, and people have these things. There's no person that doesn't have a history, some kind of gender, some kind of race, something. There's like some way to describe these things and an appearance that people can agree upon. But this character doesn't have those things. And I think because I was then creating a character that didn't have those things, that the structure of the book, I wanted to have the walls be very clear, So I'm not sure when it really happened in like the process of writing, but at some point I was like, oh, well, it should just take place during a week. And then the chapters are organized by day. And so then you're giving the reader like, you're giving them like a little map, like you're like, okay, you're going to come into this story where there's this impossible character at the center of it who won't speak. Here's a map so you don't feel like completely, thrown under the bus. So then for those who haven't read the book, that at one point, so Pew, enters this town and is sort of brought from place to place. One of the people that Pew ends up meeting is a young man who's a refugee who's been adopted by a very wealthy white family in this town. And they're kind of raising him in this like, patting themselves on the back, sort of like, we're good people. We adopted this child from this war-torn country. And they never say what country. It's unclear if even like the family knows, like they're so kind of ambivalent to Nelson, and of course that's the name they gave him. So Nelson's predicament appeals to me greatly as like a human being. If somebody told me that this was their story, I would feel, I mean, even just imagining Nelson, he's a person that doesn't exist, but even when I imagined Nelson and I sort of saw his face and sort of heard his voice in my head, I'm very moved by him, but of course that's not my experience at all. Like I was not adopted. I'm not from a war-torn country. I didn't have this kind of life. And yet there's a part of me that just like all human beings, we can all feel the pain of somebody who's gone through something that we haven't gone through. We can try and avoid that pain or, excuse it or diminish it, but we can feel it, you know. But I guess I wouldn't write a book from that perspective. Partially because it would just take me a lifetime to be able to convincingly get into that voice to the point where it would be worth a reader's time. Which is not to say that you can't write outside of, like, you know, the strict confines of where you have been born and what you've been born into. I think possibly you can, but it's just a matter of like, well, what's your entry point to these different stories, and why would you want to do that? And but so then the character of Pew, because they this is not a person that can actually exist, but because of that, then this is a character that anyone can write. Because do you know, like, when you're like, say you fell asleep at a time when you're not supposed to be asleep, and then you wake up and you're kind of for a moment confused about like where you are, who you are, what your name is, like you don't know any of these things for a few minutes. And that's also, it's like that, there's that kind of space that can exist also if you meditate or pray, or I don't know, maybe people that do yoga also feel it, like in glimmers or something. And I'm sure there's other states that you can get into where you sort of forget who you are. And I wanted to write the whole character from that place of being kind of in between. And because I think it's a kind of neglected place right now, when we really, when we're, you know, I think as a country very usefully thinking about the ways that race divides us, and the burdens that we still have to contend with and negotiate around, and at least just understand and investigate, right? So that's like making us really think about like the boundary between like my life and your life, because that boundary needs to be investigated. And yet there still is this liminal space that we all exist in too. And so I guess, I mean, I started writing this book maybe 4 or so years ago. And it was just a time that I was maybe thinking about it more than I had been at other times in my life. So that I wanted to write the book from that place.
The reason I asked is because they are both of the characters are in some way mute, even though Nelson speaks a little. I just feel like they both mute their non-community members that have been invited in, but they are still foreigners or strangers or items that can be trophicized. And the community was trying to trophize Pew because, they work around it, trying to identify where to put Pew in the mantle of their existence. And so Nelson's, who's also mute, but has a bit of bite, like kind of a statistical, almost meta bite to his existence. And so that's right, like if you were to approach, like if he were to respond to all these members who want him to speak something, you know, perhaps he will speak in the language of a flask, you know, like whiskey or bourbons or something, some sort of alcoholic language that everyone understands. And so, and it's just like a theory driven, it's not necessarily like you would sit down and write him, but I think the tension between Pew and Nelson as a torquing device that allows you to shift perspective around different characters, I just feel like Pew's response to these confessions, to these stories that are being sort of washed over Pew, that the passive response that Pew offers is just an active one of not being able to respond at all. It's like, how can you expect a chair to respond back to you no matter how much you beg and cry and say, hey, you know, I know you exist, I know you are a chair, but respond. And I think like this lack of reciprocality, you know, this lack of connection, all of these, and it makes me want to ask you this question. Are you trying to say that as a culture, we are afraid of silence? Even the people who don't usually talk, a resident like Nelson who speaks, and Mr. Coucher who end up speaking a lot, they become incredibly talkative. Like is Pew existence activate something in them that allows them to be more than who they are, than when they are not already are. Um, um, and is there a way to articulate non-communication between two people to articulate vulnerability and intimacy without the language of articulation in writing? So as I was walking through the chapters, and I'm like, oh, I'm excited about Mr. Kelser because for the first time, no one's gonna talk. No one's gonna pause. And so when Mr. Kelser starts speaking, I'm like, oh no, he's following the patterns of the community where he uses Pew as a confession booth and becomes like almost like a lot of the Catholic experience that I've experienced in the last, or the other part of my life where just everyone are like, okay, confess and all your sin is absolved at the end of the week. And so what is your relationship to silence in contemporary culture? And how is Pew a vessel for that possibility?
Oh, I like this question. Well, I think you're completely right that people generally, and I don't think it's even just American. I think it's a sort of human. I think most cultures are afraid of silence, right? Like most cultures in this era, it seems to me, we try and fill it in different ways, whether it's with language or it's with distractions of some sort. I mean, but at the same time, silence can be completely terrifying. I actually don't meditate right now, and I probably should. I mean, it's like anybody who's ever meditated for any regularly in any part of their life, and then you stop at all times, you realize like, okay, that's the wrong thing. I should be doing that because it's extremely useful, but it's also completely terrifying. And if you try and sit, I mean, anybody who's tried, like, especially when you're a beginner, just a minute, 2 minutes can be excruciating. And this is not even to say of like actually going on like a true silent retreat or something for a few days. It's like, it's almost unbearable. People don't make it through. People lose their minds trying to do it. So I think on some sort of like fundamental level, human beings are very afraid of silence. But then there's a way in which like the hospitality of Mississippi or of the South, the culture that I'm from, but I think it exists in other parts of America too. But this kind of hospitality can sometimes be so stifling that it actually pushes people into a place of silence, So like this character of Nelson, like I think that he doesn't talk to other people. And I think Mr. Kircher too, that you brought up, I think they don't really have, neither of those characters have a community. They live in a community, but they don't have it and they don't belong to it. And it doesn't matter how much the people around them say like, oh, you belong. Oh, like, here's this, here's that, like come over for dinner. There's just like there's no way to bridge the gap between the way that they see the world and then the way that this community sees the world. These two things are just too far apart. Yeah, I guess that kind of answers it. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure, like, I think you asked, like, what did I want the book, or maybe like I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but like what did I want or intend for the book to say about silence? And I think it's difficult for me to like want particular outcomes from a book, because I don't even know the whole time I'm writing it really why I'm doing it. And I'm writing it to figure out why I'm writing it. And like I will get just absorbed into like one idea or just sort of like half an image of a slight idea of like who this character is or a voice or like some sort of predicament. And then I have to write to figure out why I want to do that at all. So I don't really have, I mean, I think the other thing is that I want pretty much all books to be just sort of a space for somebody to think in. And I don't want to create a book that tells somebody what to think. And so I don't want anyone to come away from a book. I don't have like a specific agenda or a message that I want to get across in anything. Yeah, I've found that at times, like when I have written like essay or something where I do have a specific agenda and things that I want to get across, the writing becomes very bad. I know that there is a way to do that delicately, but I have understood this not to be something that I'm prone to do. So.
I thought your essay on John Berryman was really strong.
Oh, thank you. I actually was just thinking about that the other day. That essay is maybe like 10 years old, but and I don't write a ton of essays, but I guess part of the reason, I mean, the essay that we just brought up is, I kind of had this obsession with John Berryman for a number of years. And then to the point where I went to the John Berryman archive and was like reading about him, and sort of realized that he was much, I mean, I knew he was like a dark figure. I mean, I knew he was an alcoholic, he committed suicide, all these things, but I really started to sort of realize the extent of his suffering and how much his suffering is in his poetry. And then what does it say about me that I'm like so enjoying this man's suffering, as demonstrated in his poems. And I think I didn't know what I wanted to say about that. And I still don't quite know what I want to say about that. I don't have like a stance, you know? And so there's some writers that are really good about writing from a stance, you know? But I think it's kind of dangerous, you know, because what if you're wrong about that stance and only later do you realize it? And in the meantime, you've convinced a bunch of people of your idea that was incomplete or maybe harmful even. So yeah, I stick to fiction mostly. And then when I do write essays, it's usually from a place of like, I don't know what to think about this, so I'm going to write about it. And then at the end of that, I probably still won't know quite what to think about it. Yeah.
So I'm going to follow up on that essay with Pew. Mm-hmm. So if you were Catherine's in, there's a person named Catherine in John Berryman's existence. And so I think John Berryman in his drunken state pushed the woman down a flight of stairs. So if one of your characters in Pew were to push you down a flight of stairs, which one would you want of all the ones that you had? It would be a new kind of John Berryman. And why? Why would you want that person to have that over all the other characters?
Well, I guess I wouldn't. I mean, this is such a playful question. It's so fun. I mean, I wouldn't want to be pushed down the stairs, of course. But you mean like metaphorically, like in a way, like yeah. There's a bunch of ways to see that. I don't quite know. I mean, there's really. You know, I think most of the people in the book are trying to do good. They all think that they're trying to do good. And so, and to, you know, I mean, I don't want to tell anybody how to read the book, because I think there's people are going to see different things in different characters. They're going to recognize, I mean, I would hope recognize aspects of themselves in different characters. I also don't quite think of the characters as people, like John Berryman was a real person, and so when I read his poems and I know that he wrote them and I know that he existed and lived and died, I have like even though I never met him and he essentially is a character in my brain, I know that he existed. And so I treat the character of John Berryman slightly differently than I treat the characters of fiction, or like especially my fiction. So on the one hand, none of my characters can push me down the stairs because the characters are ideas. They're just sort of, you know, it's this, there's a set of ideas that sort of exist that I can't quite put into words. And so I put them into a character, or the characters sort of arise and I realize like, oh, this one's carrying all these different ways of viewing the world that I either have seen in somebody or have felt in myself. And like, there it is. And whatever, and we'll have to give it a name, I guess. Sometimes I'm very reluctant to like give characters names, but usually to keep things straight, you need to do that. But I guess I would want, you know, so the sets of ideas that are in the book that have characters' names, I guess the one that I would want to like recognize their own capacity for brutality would be the one, like would be like the preachers. I mean, that's like my personal like feeling about it. Like, you know, there's like a few preachers in there and different people that work at the church, and I don't think I don't think that the book has a stance about churches. Like I don't think that it's in there. And I'm also like of many minds about like the existence of like organized religion, but I do think that one of the dangers of organized religion, and I grew up in, you know, Protestant Methodist Southern churches, but part of the danger of it is that you can think that you're only doing good, and you can't always see when you're in the act of thinking that you're doing something good, the harm that you could be causing accidentally and like outside of your own awareness. Like even right now with sort of like, as we, you know, a lot of people are like really thinking about their everyday decisions and the little things that they do where they're like, wow, was that kind of a racist gesture? Or is that like a sort of a sexist thought? Or like, in what ways am I treating people differently in public based on like what it seems like their socioeconomic status is? Or like, where am I afraid? Where am I this? Where am I that? Like, as we're kind of, it's a time where people are thinking about these things a lot more, especially like under the sort of Black Lives Matter umbrella. I feel like it's a very loud conversation in most people's brains, right? Maybe not most people, but a lot of people's brains. You can wish it was most people, but it's probably not. But anyway, as we're sort of thinking about these things, there's of course things that you're not seeing, you know, there's the question that you're not asking yourself that maybe you won't recognize until, you know, 30 years from now, and you'll look back and say like, oh, I used to view the world this way, and I didn't even realize that I was viewing the world that way, even at a time when I was trying to scrutinize the way that I'm viewing the world. You're always going to miss things. And so from that place, like once you sort of understand that you contain these contradictions that you're not even aware of, then it's really difficult to look at other people's behavior and be like quite as judgmental. Of course, you can still like have judgments and have opinions and, you know, think that maybe you kind of have a good idea about how to do this or that, but it becomes much more difficult to have a kind of absolutist stance about anything. Yeah, so I would want any of the characters in there that have a place, feelings of like of absolute, to call those into question and sort of recognize their own capacity for brutality.
Oh, I think Nelson would push you down just to see. You can feel the fall, but then he'll be speeded up at the end, at the foot of the stair to catch you. I think
I like that.
And I think like pushing people just so that they can feel that edge, just to see where, like based on Nelson's state of existence and being, I feel that he is also mute in a way because the community is not really listening to his needs and desire and his own past.
Right.
And there's an element of him wanting to, like, this alcohol is, the alcoholness is substituting some of the emotional perplexity that he has with the community. And I just feel like if he has the opportunity to like get someone to really understand what it's like to be in him, like pushing someone metaphorically down a flight of stairs would be the beginning of that conversation. Because there's an element of like action, of being something of movement.
I love that you've picked up so much on him, because he was a character that I felt like gravitated towards rather naturally, and I enjoyed like I think you've used the word edge a couple times with him. He does sort of provide an edge of the community. He's been there, many years, and sort of sees things a bit more clearly than people that are living in it. And he's one of the only characters that comes back again. Like there's the family that takes Pew in, and then there's all these other people that sort of, it's almost like a lineup where Pew meets like one person after another, and you usually never see any of them again. But he has like 2 full scenes in the book.
She makes a return. The woman from the gas station, you know, like sweetheart.
That's right. That's right. People do come back, but most people don't get like more like 2 conversations, you know, like 2 long conversations with Pew. And I think I didn't really have a reason for doing it that way. And there were other characters that like, you know, I write a lot and I cut a lot. And so there were other characters that came back, and there were other things that, but they all kind of, well, we don't need you again. We don't need you again. But the second scene with Nelson always made sense to me, and I didn't really know why. But I think you're really making me see him a little bit differently now, as a kind of like, it's possible that I think one like valid read of the book is that Pew's experience is almost like a kind of double ghost for Nelson's experience in a way, because the town thinks they understand him and they don't. And they think that they're just doing good and they aren't. And so, because they're not really witnessing him in a complex way, you know? And he's suffering like right in front of their faces and they don't realize it. So yeah, I always feel like there's almost infinite like correct ways to read a book. Or like I feel that way about my books. Like I don't feel like I'm the authority on them. And I think that like they kind of all follow their own weird logic when I'm writing them that I don't feel like I'm completely in control of. And so when they go out into the world and other people see different things in them, I just think, oh, that's great. That seems valid. That seems valid. Like the only like incorrect way I feel like you can read a book is if you're like, it has to be malicious. You know, like you can always like, I think go into any book and like just decide, this is what this is and this is what this is. And then you're not really being very like open-hearted as you read. Like I feel that with myself, with my own like reading habits too. Like when you start to kind of shut down or question the foundation of the book, then you're not really being an open-hearted reader, you know, because I think most stories do contain like many, many ways that you can read them, and they're all like useful. So
I mean, I was very drawn to Annie.
Mm-hmm.
Hilda. But Annie, because I think like her existence to me seems like solutions for the community, right? Like she's thinking of resolutions, ways in which the community can be outside of its own limited bounds,
Mm-hmm.
and sees so much solutions. And oftentimes, like when someone offer a, you know, like a suggestion to do something better, for instance, it always come as an attack of like, oh, she's being a communist, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's and so I do like Annie a lot, even though she feels more. She doesn't feel like a character. Of all your characters that you built, she exists on a more theoretical plane. Like
Yeah.
there are certain characters that you feel there's like human contentness to their existence because they either have witnessed, you know, or endure like hardships in the communities, or when you recognize when a woman adhere to her husband's kind of, I don't know, like unintentional evil ways in which like one eyes are being stabbed and still saying, oh, he's my Charlie, can't do that, you know. It's I just feel that Annie seems to exist in the liminal space between the desire of wanting to give resolution to a community that cannot accept any kind of resolutions. And I wonder if your book, like when I read your book, I have a lot of like where my consciousness bifurcate to like a tree. It just bifurcate through different routes of existence, in which I wonder, well, if like when I finished the book, I'm like, oh, they need a forgiveness festival for the forgiveness festival. And so that was my first, and if that were to exist, then if you were to open the book with the forgiveness festival where everyone is making all of these like, oh my God, like confessions that you only see news on, like I see those confessions as like headlines on Twitter, on Instagrams, on, you know, on the news, on Facebook, you know. So these are like, these confessions feels like, and I wonder what would be like once you hear all that confessions to generate so much doubt in the community that they start like, oh, who made that confession, you know, like, and then begins to feed the fire for doubts and questioning their existence, and who could possibly name such confessions. And there is like, even though there's a sea of confession, there's one that will always pop out in your consciousness when you are moving in that kind of oceans of words and emotions, that there's one that will be pulled out and just like drives you absolutely crazy. And I was just curious to see what the relationship with the members would be like. Like how would that silence of omission, silence of the realization that, you know, their husband may have cheated on them, or who did sleep with my girl, you know, my best friends, you know, like all these things that will shuffle up the card, the deck, the emotional, the moral, the intellectual cards within these characters. And so I'm just trying to imagine like their relationship, like, and I'm like, okay, if Pew were to be a confession booth, then how would Pew's existence help or not help these these community members resolve their own sins, and so or internal conflicts with the community, because oftentimes you see, oh, this is the perfect community who cares, and in fact is the opposite. And so my mind just went like bifurcated toward that, because I thought I felt like when I read the end of the book, that was the beginning of the book. Like I thought all the weekday that was working toward it, finally it settled in a place where everything has potential to open up, and it closes. And oftentimes that happens in life, you know, when you work so hard for something and you make this wonderful dish, and in 2 seconds everyone finished eating it, and then you realize, oh, but the meal just started and you feel hungry. And so after I finished the book, I felt hungry. I was like, whoa.
But I think that's actually like sort of an aim that this book in particular, but kind of the books in general, but this one maybe more than the other ones. Like I do want it to do this sort of opening. I do want it to, like, at the end of it, for you to still be sort of pursuing the lines of thought that it brings up. I mean, that's what my hope is. It's a short book, you know, and it's abstracted to some degree. And so to me, it's more of like a tool to sort of get a brain to sort of start thinking along, you know, a path that maybe we don't often go on. I don't feel like I had gone on before. And so I, you know, wanted to pursue it. I do think another interesting thing that you brought up was this idea that like some of the characters have like humanness, and then some of them are like much more clearly abstracted. And you brought up Annie as being one that like is a bit more abstracted, and she in the book is a teenager who is it's almost like she's like just about to be radicalized or something, but she doesn't quite know her way around things yet, and she's just starting to question the community that she's been born into. And so she is in a place of kind of liminality and confusion and a place of questioning. And so yeah, she's a bit more theoretical, I think is also the word that you used. She is in a kind of like theoretical mode. But then it made me think, well, but since some of the other characters, as much as I think of the characters as abstractions and sort of receptacles for thought, receptacles for ideas, of course, sometimes the characters actually do seem human, and the voices seem like a real person speaking. And I feel like the divide between these things is always, it generally has something to do with story. Like the more of somebody's history that you hear them telling you, the more human they seem to you. It's easy when you're like walking down the street and you pass 15 people, you don't really think much about them. But if one of them stopped and just had 30 seconds to say like, my house caught on fire last week and my grandmother's in the hospital, like just that, it would change your perception of them by like, infinite times over, just by hearing somebody say something that's happened to them. I think as human beings, we just can't help but sort of relate to almost any story that we hear. If you really hear somebody just say it, probably because most stories have all the same things in common. There's joy and death and suffering and light, and like we all have experienced these same things, just in different kind of combinations.
I feel that way with Miss Columbus. I think of all the characters, I thought, oh, this is perhaps Pew is her long lost John, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember her son's name, but her son that's gone missing. Yeah.
And I thought, oh, maybe Pew is this entity.
Yeah, you want it for her, but
then you realize is not. But there was a moment in which I felt like her pain and her suffering, it's so palpable, like she's not there to lecture. She's not there to, she's just there to state the obvious.
Right. There's like a different version of the book where that character just takes Pew home. Yeah. And it's like, this is not my son, but like I need a son, and so here's my child now. How
was that erased from history? The book history.
That was never written into it. I never wrote it that way, but I do think that like, the funny thing, and I know you've experienced this too, but like when you write a story or a book or whatever, the first sentence, there's like so many possibilities of what can come next. And then the second sentence, there's slightly fewer, and then the longer you get into something, the more inevitable the end of the book is, and so if you choose this instead of that, you can only end the book in these sort of ways. And it's not like you can see it, but it's almost like this image that you brought up earlier of like the brain going into like a tree, once you get up to this twig right here, you can't just like jump over and end on this twig. You have to go back down to this part of the branch and then branch off, and like that. So I think that didn't come up as a possibility, but I feel like one could go to the end of the book and sort of unravel and back it up to a certain point, and then you could end that way, and I don't think that would be necessarily even wrong. Like, I think it would still be the same book, or it still could be the same book. But anyway,
would Pew be different if they had adopted Jesse's method, in which writing a manuscript in a really short burst as opposed to across like a year or two? I mean, it did end up taking you a year and a half to complete it, and you tried the first month and it took you 3 months actually. So do you think your ending would have been different if you had gone for the true burst, like where you just do it in 3 weeks?
I think so. I mean, I've pushed him on that because like I think what would happen if he did spend 2 years writing one of these books, that like, so what Via is referencing is that my partner writes books, but he when he writes a novel, he writes it in basically a week. So when it's time for him to write a book, he just goes to it every day and then he finishes it. like within a few days, and that's that, and he doesn't really go back and revise, and he just sort of commits to the path that he's going on and does it. And that was sort of, I had never written a book like that, and I thought, well, what would happen if I really tried to see something completely, and in what to me felt like a very quick span of time of a month. I gave myself a little more time than him, since I usually was taking 3 or 4 years to do a book. I think, well, it's hard to, no, what? I don't think it would. If I had successfully written the book in a week, that I felt the book, when I had the idea for it, I felt what it should be, but I didn't have, obviously, the words to describe that book. I didn't have the words that I was going to use to write it quite yet. And that's what the process of writing is. It's like, figuring out how to translate the feeling, which feels complete. Like every time I've started to write something that I've known is like, with the idea is like, vibrant enough that I'm going to write either a book or a story or something's going to happen here. Once I'm committed to that feeling, I have enough faith that it's actually I'm going to reach the conclusion, but I will know if it's correct or not. Like that's what the revising process is for me. And so if I had somehow had the energy or confidence or something to sit with the feeling long enough to actually translate it, and then I had successfully translated it, and I could look at it and say, like, yes, that is the feeling, it could have taken a week. It just happens. I think I'm just a little bit more distractible, and I don't mind wasting time writing. I actually kind of enjoy the process of writing lots of things, and then the freedom of actually just deleting them is, I enjoy that process. And that's sort of what I realized also in trying to write something a little bit faster, or trying to speed up the process of translating the feeling into the book. So I kind of realized I like wasting the time, but I think it would have been the same book if I had completed it, because when it's not there. You as a writer know this, like, when you've written something and it's like, it's almost there, but it's not quite there. And I don't know how to describe the gap, but the gap is there.
So if your vision for Pew is crisp, and there was a moment when I read your book where it's like, I feel like the son was dead too, but for sure the 4 daughters did all die in a shipwreck, and he gets to nude and sit down and write the song. Was there a point in your life where you felt like you had lost 4 daughters and sitting down to write this Pew? Is that how the vision is so crisp? Is because there is this urgency for it that you felt?
Yeah, I do think that. I think that
and who are your 4?
Well, I think what immediately comes to mind is when I was a child, I grew up in a Methodist church, and my family is not very, we went to church every week and we did a lot of church-based things, but my family in particular is not very fundamental or anything. But I became sort of a fundamentalist on my own by just reading the Bible, taking it very seriously. Everybody, in my family was like a believer, and I think had, would consider themselves Christian most of them would. And certainly when I was a child, we all did. And I felt that way. I felt, like this urgency very young, like 5th or 6th grade, where I just felt like, oh, this is exactly how the world is. There's heaven, there's hell. You have to take Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. You have to get as many people as you can to also do that. And it's urgent. It's like, it's not just life or death, it's eternity. It's like the most urgent feeling that you can have. And also it's this clarity. It's this total drug of like, it gives you a mission in life. I mean, when I was a kid, I already felt like my mission had to have something to do with saving people. And it makes you feel very important, and it's pretty intoxicating. And it also answers all questions you have about existence. And so to have that kind of metaphysical, moral, universal clarity, and then, over time, through my own reading other things that were not the Bible, meeting people from other cultures that were not from a Christian, Protestant, Southern American upbringing, I sort of started to see things a little bit differently and not quite as extreme as, will happen. And and it was, you know, heartbreaking. Like there's no other word for it. You know, I think both to realize, and there's different sorts of heartbreak that are in there. Like on the one hand, I sometimes feel like so much of my childhood was taken from me because I didn't really get a chance to just be a kid, you know, like I and not because of something somebody else is doing to me, but by my own sort of making very serious my life, you know. And maybe in some ways that was just an amazing, like long, you know, game of make believe that I got to play as a child. And so there's, you know, there's maybe hopeful ways to think about it too. So yeah, and then on the other side, it's just like it's heartbreaking to remember how clear and total that feeling was, and how there's just nothing else on earth that will feel like that, because that, you know, I won't lie to myself that way anymore. So maybe that was it.
Well, thank you for your thoroughness in answering that. There was one toward the end of the Forgiveness Festival. There was one that there was one passage that I really felt connected to, and it's I think it's this one where it says here, well, it is the worst for girls, since we're talking about your childhood and being serious. It's for worse for girl, I think, and this is from page 151. Whereas worse for girls, I think everyone's worried about their house or cars getting broken into, since everything gets forgiven at the festival and all goes away. Do you think forgiveness gives us license to be cruel? Is the festival of forgiveness a festival of cruelty?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I you know, it's like one of the questions I certainly had as a kid too, was like, you know, if all of your sins are washed away on Sunday when you ask forgiveness, or
Yeah.
anytime when you ask forgiveness, then like what is a personal history anymore, and what really makes something good or bad? Yeah, I do wonder about that. But I think on another level, like even right now, where I think a lot of white Americans want there to be some sort of like vanishing of parts of American history, and like, well, let's not focus on the bad, let's focus on all the good things that we've done, you know, and like, well, we've already dealt with that, we've already done passed these laws and that, so we really just need to focus on like what's ahead, you know. That's a kind of it's a particular sort of idea about like what redemption is, and does redemption make something actually vanish? And I think that's kind of a Protestant idea, this idea that once you're forgiven for something, it no longer matters. Like there's a story, and I don't actually remember if this is in the Bible or if this was like some kind of you know, devotional type thing that I heard in youth group. But so, you know, there's a man who's like sinned and done something, and then he prays and is forgiven. And then shortly after that, he dies and he's in heaven and he meets Jesus, and he asks him about this, you know, this thing that he already was given forgiveness for. Like what did I like, what did Jesus think about forgiving him about this? Or like, what did he think about the fact that he did this bad thing? And Jesus doesn't even know what he's talking about. You know, this idea that like, that Jesus's forgiveness, that like this Christian idea of forgiveness that's so total that you cease to even know what you've forgiven somebody for, is just so, it's just so funny to me now. But I took it very seriously then, you know. And what do you even make of that? Like, what does it mean that like, you know, if I did something bad to like my partner and then he forgave me, and then like a few years later, he didn't even know that it had happened, I would be worried about like, is he losing his mind? You know, like you need to sort of be able to keep track of things that have happened. There's nothing wrong with like knowing a history, you know?
I think our 1 hour is up.
Okay.
I would ask you more questions, but I didn't. It was planned for an hour, and I I just want to meet the festival's chronological frame. And so thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fee. Those were really fun questions. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Catherine and V. And thank you, audience members who are still with us for attending this Montana Book Festival event. I'd like to shout out the Whitefish Review again. Thank you for sponsoring this year's virtual events. As a reminder to those of you watching, you can purchase Pew by Catherine Lacey, as well as books by V at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. And you can purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There, I urge you to donate so we can continue virtual programming like this into the fall with our MBF Plus events. Thank you again, Catherine and V. I'm so glad you were able to make this conversation for us.
Next time in Missoula.
Yes. Next time we'll host you in Missoula. I hope so. All right. Have a great day, you two.
Bye.
Bye.